All right. So should we just play this? Should we
Yeah.
just play the? Okay. So here we go.
In Turkey, we have a partner in the government. In Syria, we have a partner in the form of NGOs on the ground who are providing humanitarian support.
But let me just follow up on this because the Syrian government, as far as I know, it's a government that you still recognize. You have never unrecognized the Syrian government. So why not reach out to the Syrian government? They are in power. They're the ones that run these rescue operations or aid operations and so on. It would be a great gesture. Another gesture would be to sort of lift the sanctions that have basically, suffocated Syria.
Said, and I'm going to resist the temptation to go into your advocacy rather than questioning, but I will make the point that it would be quite ironic, if not even counterproductive, for us to reach out to a government that has brutalized its people over the course of a dozen years now, gassing them, slaughtering them, being responsible for much of the suffering that they've endured. Instead, we have humanitarian partners on the ground who can provide the type of assistance in the aftermath of these tragic earthquakes, but these humanitarian partners who have been active on the ground since the earliest days of the civil war. This is a regime, Saeed, that has never shown any inclination to put the welfare, the well-being, the interests of its people first. Now that its people are suffering even more, we're going to continue doing what has proven effective over the course of the past dozen years or so, providing significant amounts of humanitarian assistance to partners on the ground. These partners who, unlike the Syrian regime, are there to help the people rather than brutalize them.
It's amazing because, I'm sorry, what has the U.S. been doing in Syria for the last decade? Funding and arming a collection of jihadist groups to brutalize, slaughter, and terrorize people, and also in some cases gas people. So I don't think the U.S. is in a position to be speaking about moral superiority. Also, what does any of this have to do with the aftermath of an earthquake? Like your sanctions, listen, I have been in touch with so many people who are asking me, what can their organizations do? What can individuals do who are in the U.S. to help Syria after this horrible earthquake that has left over 20,000 people in Syria and Turkey dead? And the death toll's been rising with every day that passes. And I have been, it's like pulling teeth. Actually, pulling teeth is easier. It is almost impossible to send aid to Syria. Like one of the only ways you can do that to Syrian government areas is by sending money or supplies to a specific individual in Lebanon who then has to physically take it into Syria because you cannot make transactions to Syria. And it's almost impossible to send anything on a plane to Syria because so few planes are coming in, because not Syria has an airport that Israel bombs sometimes, but planes have to be insured in order for them to land in that airport. And you can't be insured without dealing with the government. And Syria is under such intense blockade, you can't deal with the government in any capacity. It's actually easier to do transactions with Cuba than it is to do transactions with Syria. Because with Cuba, also surrounding countries aren't prevented from sending aid to Cuba, or doing transactions with Cuba. It's specifically the U.S., right?
Yeah.
That prohibits the U.S. And then it has other things where, if your ship lands at a port in Cuba, it can't go to the U.S. for a 6 months until 6 months have passed and things like this. With Syria, the U.S. unilateral sanctions on Syria are applied to surrounding countries, to any other country. So the U.S., it's like extraterritorial bullshit that is completely counter to international law. But basically it prevents even Lebanon or Iraq from doing business with Syria. If you do business with Syria, you will be hit with secondary sanctions. So if the Syrian central bank is sanctioned, I mean, it's completely insane. And I mean, one of the worst things that's taking place right now that was already a problem before this earthquake is Syria has this horrible gasoline shortage and fuel shortage. So it has almost no electricity, and people aren't able to drive their vehicles because they don't have gasoline, right? So imagine after an earthquake, you can't fuel your first responder vehicles to go save people. You can't fuel industrial equipment like cranes or other equipment you might need to move the rubble of a building to get to people who are trapped underneath rubble, because we all saw these horrible images of building collapses. And so it's like so many more people have died in Syria than needed to, for the mere fact that in the 48 to 72 hours after this horrible disaster, Syria did not have the capacity to even respond appropriately to save people who could have been saved had Syria not been under sanctions. And then even beyond that, I mean, one of the biggest problems I'm hearing from people I know who work in Syria, who are surveying the damage and seeing what does Syria actually need right now. I mean, obviously in the first couple of days, the most important thing is being able to reach people to find survivors. That period has mostly passed, right? It's been like 4 or 5 days now, or 4 days. So now the immediacy of what they need is, you have these buildings that have structural damage and people aren't sure if they can return to their homes. So a lot of people are sleeping outside, and it's very, very cold. So they need engineers. They need to be able to dispatch engineers to go survey the damage to see what buildings are fit to go back inside of and which buildings are not. And even in order to do this, you need gasoline to fuel vehicles. You need to be able to pay engineers. And you can't even get that kind of aid into Syria. Obviously, their medical system was already barely able to deal with like everyday issues, let alone deal with this crisis after an earthquake where you have all kinds of horrible injuries for those who've survived. I mean, the needs are immense, but they were already immense before this because of sanctions. And we saw today that the US Treasury Department, after some pressure and some a bit of lobbying and pressure from certain international organizations, humanitarian organizations, they issued this general license that just is a sort of umbrella exemption for humanitarian aid. Because usually with humanitarian aid, you have to apply for an OFAC license with the Treasury Department, which can take many months. If you want to send humanitarian aid for their supposed humanitarian exemption, that almost never works. But now they've issued a general license up through August. And whether banks will abide, but will actually because there's something called a chilling effect when it comes on sanctions like this, where even if there's exemptions, banks and companies that make parts that are needed will still decline to do any sort of transactions because they just fear accidentally violating sanctions. Because if you accidentally violate sanctions, it doesn't matter your intentions, you're liable to pay huge sums of money as a penalty, right? So there's a chilling effect where organizations and banks will just refuse to even get involved with anything that has the word Syria in it in the first place. But so it's still, we need to wait and see if this general license even makes a difference in terms of that chilling effect. But regardless, you have had like we saw with Ned Price, as well as other administration officials actively saying and insisting that their sanctions do not obstruct humanitarian aid. If that's the case, why did you have to issue a general license so that there wouldn't be obstacles to humanitarian aid? You know what I'm saying? It's obvious, because I interviewed on Dispatches on Breakthrough News. I interviewed about I think 2 or 3 months ago, the UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, Alina Duhan, which is basically they have a UN Special Rapporteur on sanctions at the UN, which is pretty cool. She had spent about 12 days, I think, in Syria, traveling the country, seeing the impact of sanctions. And again, this is before the earthquake. And what she described in her report and what she described to me is a country where most children are eating 1 meal a day because of the level of food insecurity, where people aren't going to school because there's no heat in the schools and there's no gasoline for their cars to get to school and it's too cold outside, where people spend most of the day without electricity and basically going to bed at 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. because it's cold and just being under blankets as a family. Basically having no future, having a medical system that can't respond to anyone's needs. And again, this is a place that used to grow most of its own food. It was food secure, and it also manufactured most of its own medications. It had one of the best medical sectors in the region, and that's gone now because of both the war and now sanctions. And the last thing I'll add here is that with the situation in Syria as it is right now, I'm so disgusted by the fact that there's people claiming that are trying to make the argument that lifting sanctions is somehow manipulative or political, and that that like anybody who says that is an Assadist, while you have to only donate to the white helmets because they'll take care of everything. They're not operating in Syrian government areas. Like they're operating in opposition areas. And like, if you want to talk about corruption, you want to tell me that the NGOs operating in Idlib aren't also corrupt and aren't also going to siphon off some of that money, because they absolutely are. So like, give me a fucking break. But it's just completely outrageous that there's like actually like an article in the Washington Post yesterday, and the title of it was something along the lines of "Don't lift the sanctions on Syria just because of the earthquake." And it's like,
Right.
what is wrong with these people?